You ever have one of those moments, where you're absolutely certain you're right, only to have someone completely dismantle your entire argument in like 5 minutes? Well, today we're talking about one of the most famous examples of that in science history. It's the story of physicist Freeman Dyson and his career-changing meeting with the legendary Enrico Fermi.
Listen to this quote from Dyson himself. It just sets the whole scene, doesn't it? He says Fermi politely but ruthlessly demolished his work. But then he adds that he's eternally grateful. He wasn't mad, he was thankful for a hard truth that saved him from who knows how many more years of wasted effort. So, what exactly happened in that meeting?
All right, so to really get why Dyson was so grateful, we have to rewind the clock to 1953. Freeman Dyson, a brilliant young professor at Cornell, is leading this team of super sharp graduate students. And they are on a roll, fresh off a huge success in the world of physics, and they're looking for their next mountain climb.
To really appreciate their confidence, you gotta understand where they were coming from. See, Dyson's team had just done some amazing work with quantum electrodynamics, or QED. It's the theory that describes the weak forces between electrons and photons. And their calculations, they matched the experimental data perfectly. It was a spectacular success. So they thought, why not use the same playbook on the big one, the strong nuclear force, the stuff that literally holds the universe together at the atomic level? If it worked for weak forces, it's got to work for strong ones, right? And you know what? After years of what Dyson himself called heroic efforts, it looked like they'd nailed it. Their graphs, their theoretical calculations, they lined up beautifully with the actual experimental data that Fermi's own lab in Chicago had produced. You can just imagine the celebration, the relief. All that hard work had finally paid off. So Dyson, beaming with pride, sets up a meeting to go show the master himself what they'd accomplished.
So Dyson hops on a bus to Chicago, and you really have to picture this scene. He's about to present his team's masterpiece to Enrico Fermi, a true giant of physics, a guy who was just as brilliant with theories as he was with experiments. This is the man who built the first nuclear reactor, for crying out loud. Getting his seal of approval, that would mean everything.
So Dyson walks in, hands over these beautiful graphs showing the perfect match, and Fermi barely even looks at them. After a bit of friendly chit-chat, he just quietly lays out his judgment. He explains that for him, there are really only two ways for theory and physics to be any good.
And then he just drops this bombshell. In one quiet sentence, he completely dismantles years of their work. You have neither. Can you even imagine hearing that? Dyson was stunned. He asked him, "What do you mean our math isn't solid?"
Well, Fermi calmly explained that their whole approach had a huge, fundamental flaw. See, unlike the weak forces they'd mastered before, these strong nuclear forces were so incredibly powerful that the math just, it didn't really work. It didn't converge. So to make their numbers actually fit the data, they had to rely on these, let's call them mathematical patches. Fermi called them arbitrary cutoff procedures. They weren't based on any real physics. Their whole theory was basically a house of cards.
But Dyson wasn't ready to give up. He was desperate. He had one last card to play. He just couldn't accept that the beautiful, perfect agreement with the experimental data meant absolutely nothing. So he asks him, right? He points to the numbers, to the hard evidence. But look how well our theory matches your measurements. Isn't that impressive? It's the most logical question in the world. How can you argue with the data?
Fermi's response was another question, a really simple one. He just asked, how many arbitrary parameters did you use for your calculations? Dyson paused, thought about all those little mathematical patches and fudge factors they'd used. The answer was 4.
And that was it. That was the end of the conversation. Fermi dropped this now famous quote from the brilliant mathematician John von Neumann, and it was the final nail in the coffin. The point is, if you give a theorist enough adjustable knobs to turn, enough little fudge factors, they can make any theory fit any set of data. That beautiful agreement that Dyson was so proud of, it was totally meaningless.
Dyson thanked Fermi, and then he took that long, quiet, and probably pretty miserable bus ride all the way back to Cornell. And now he had this awful task ahead of him, telling his dedicated students that their years of heroic work had basically led them down a dead end. But here's the thing, they handled it like absolute pros. They didn't just throw their hands up and walk away. Nope! They finished all the calculations and they published the paper anyway, just to make sure the students got the credit they absolutely deserved for all their hard work. And then, they all moved on. Dyson himself packed up and went to Berkeley to start over in a completely different field.
Okay, so now let's fast forward 50 years. Dyson, with all the benefit of hindsight, is looking back on that one fateful meeting, and he's thinking about the incredible wisdom behind Fermi's ruthless but ultimately kind critique.
And the conclusion was just inescapable. Fermi was right. He was absolutely, fundamentally, 100% right. But the question is, how did he know? After all, the data, the numbers on the page, they all seemed to say that Dyson's theory was correct.
Well, the answer came later with a discovery that completely turned physics on its head: the quark. It turns out that the particles Dyson's team were studying, mesons, protons, they weren't fundamental particles at all. They were actually made of even smaller things called quarks. This was the giant, essential missing piece of the puzzle.
And this, to me, is the most incredible part of the whole story. Fermi died years before quarks were ever discovered. He had no data, no theory, nothing to even suggest they existed. He just knew. His deep physical intuition, that gut feeling that only comes from a lifetime of wrestling with the universe, told him that the theories they had back then were incomplete. Something big, something essential was missing. And that gut feeling saved Dyson and his team from spending their careers chasing a ghost down a blind alley.
And really, it leaves us with a pretty fascinating question for our own time, doesn't it? Today, in an age where we are drowning in big data, where machine learning and algorithms can spot patterns that no human ever could, what's the role of that deep, human, physical intuition? How much should we trust that little voice in our head that says something just isn't right, even when all the numbers on the screen are telling us that it is? Something to think about.